We're going to do the opening address now, a delayed opening address from my good friend Craig Foster. So no introduction needed for Fozzie. Everyone here knows Fozzie's work as a footballer, a commentator, an advocate, and an Australian of the Year candidate even. So Fozzie's just taken it upon himself to walk up. I haven't introduced him officially yet, but I will let him do that. So a round of applause for Craig Foster. Thank you.
All right, guys, thank you deeply for the opportunity to just say a few words this morning. Sorry I was late. I was over checking on the Johnny Warren statue, making sure that it wasn't covered up. I just wanted to start by saying today I feel like an academic, I feel like a journalist, I feel like a writer, I feel like an author. Just kidding. I want to acknowledge our international guests who are in town. Many of you, of course, Thomas, who is a legendary player, as well as an author, of course. Nick Harris, who many of you know does brilliant work. Philippe Auclair works, a phenomenal journalist, and works with us, including at Stan Sport and elsewhere, and so many others. I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're on as well. I know that you would have done it at the start, but it's particularly important given, you know, the year that we're in, the big question that we're being posed this year, and given, I think, the tortured history of football when it comes to First Nations involvement, rights, representation, authority, power. I would imagine that we are one of the primary vehicles in the country to come to this question in the appropriate way. I certainly will be voting yes, and am and will be encouraging everyone else to do likewise. But it's important because you come together today for the first time on the eve of a World Cup in Australia. And that's an incredibly auspicious and really important moment to have some of the conversations that we're having here. But also I just want to acknowledge that a couple of guys that you might know that I used to work with by the name of Les Murray and Johnny Warren, I don't speak for them, no one can, because they were legends, but I'm pretty sure that they'd be pretty excited today, just a few days out from a Women's World Cup being in Australia. They also, though, would heavily support the conversations that are going on here. And it's kind of sad in a way that intellectual discussion of the game, holding the game accountable, talking about human rights, talking about inclusivity and where the game falls down is seen globally, and here we come under that umbrella, is seen as somewhat fringe or radical and is still not really truly accepted. Actually, these gatherings are the most important in the game. We heard before about the top of the pyramid being held accountable by the bottom, and that conversation was around member federations. That's in part true. Actually, as well, and I would say overwhelmingly more so, it is fans and it is journalists and it is people of conscience who love football, that this room is full of, who are responsible and who have a duty, particularly former players, who've made a living from the game, who've had an image created from the game, and who can profit from that from the rest of their lives, have a deep responsibility to hold our own game accountable. And the game globally has huge challenges, immense challenges. We heard about sports washing here earlier, the economic takeover of the game from nation states, the lack of authenticity in the social causes that the game purports to support. All of these issues are ones that should fill our waking hours, because we ultimately, the people, are the ones who support the game, buy the shirts, buy the tickets, and we make the ultimate decisions. That much is clear. This World Cup is really important because we get the opportunity to hold ourselves accountable, as you just heard here before. And as we were prepared to talk about Qatar and migrant workers and LGBTI rights and women's rights and other things, this is a wonderful opportunity, not just for us, but for the world, which is why we're so pleased that our international colleagues have come to Australia to talk about where we're falling short. And that's important. Particularly, I want to mention in the area of First Nations rights. In a year where we have a referendum around the Uluru Statement and the voice to Parliament, one of the most important decisions that we've ever been called to as Australians, we have the opportunity here to do something really substantive and to question ourselves as to what is our real commitment to First Nations in football, not through football. And so what is interesting, I know you've got an Indigenous panel later among many other outstanding conversations, and last night we saw acknowledgement of country, and we see for some years now Indigenous art on the Matilda shirts, which is so wonderful. And we see First Nations culture being held up by the game. But the question that we have to ask is, where is the substance behind that? You know, just in the last 8-9 days, I had the opportunity to be up in the Gold Coast with two teams who consider themselves as community-led national representative First Nations teams. They call themselves the Indigenous Roos and Koalas. And they play in the national championships. Over 100 communities come together for Indigenous-owned and led and managed competitions. And out of that, they select these two national teams. And to go in with them and to learn from the elders and just to be there humbly, but to see the pride that they have. Footballers, same as us, but with incredible, immense pride in their own cultures, in their own communities, and in pulling on their own shirt, is to see, really, I think, in this country, in many ways, the real essence of football, where it all starts, that real love. But do you know, those organisations, including the one in New Zealand and this one in Australia, it's called the Australian Indigenous Football Council, have asked for recognition from the broader body, and indeed from FIFA, wrote to Gianni Infantino after the two organisations signed a football treaty quite recently. They've heard nothing back. In fact, the Australian Football Federation asked them essentially, look, just hand over your IP. We think that we should be doing this. Right. Okay. You'll have an opportunity. I'll be interested. Yeah. Yeah. Great. Okay. Thanks. Okay. Great. Okay. Great. Thanks, John. Great. Thank you. Thank you. So John just said that that's not true, that actually an olive branch has been extended from who? Okay. So I'm not, to me, this is not a political discussion. This is a discussion about Indigenous football. It's got nothing to do with politics as far as I'm concerned. So, yeah. Sure. Sure. Great. Okay. Great. So thank you. So the Australian Indigenous Football Council this morning, I think, put the letter on that they'd received from Football Australia. I think it might have been from the CEO or perhaps the chair, which asked them to do exactly what I've just said. So I think that's on Facebook this morning. Anyway, the point is, the question has to be raised as to where is the substance behind all of the symbolism, which is wonderful and which we haven't really had before. So, you know, whilst we support that, that's a fantastic response and the first step. But beyond that, you know, where is Indigenous football? We all know what's happened in the past. This is the moment, particularly if the World Cup is going to display, you know, our First Nations culture, your First Nations culture, then what are we doing? And so I'll be interested in, you know, your response to that. Thank you. Thank you. And so also the world should be coming here and journalists and asking exactly the same question. But not only within the Australian context, and just going back to the voice referendum, it's about self-determination, as all of you are well aware. So the question is, Are we going to move beyond advisory councils for Indigenous Australians and First Nations to be able to manage their own game and manage their own pathways? And that's what they've formally asked for. And I happen to very, very strongly support it. In fact, they're asking the Maoris and Indigenous Football Council is asking FIFA to start a conversation around what Indigenous football looks like globally. FIFA, as you heard, have a human rights policy which obligates them to the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples of 2007. One of the core principles of that policy is self-determination for Indigenous peoples, which means Indigenous-led, Indigenous-owned, Indigenous-managed. So the question is open as to what is Australia doing in this regard. If we get that right and start to walk down that path, I think football in this country can lead, which is, in the end, what we're all after. I congratulate you all for being here. Many, many years ago, when we were still on SBS, probably 20 years ago, we used to talk about a national conference and the football community coming together to ask all of these important questions and have a broad range of diverse views. And sadly, our game hasn't really been capable or willing to do that on the national level. I also want to acknowledge that many of you in the room are domestic-based journalists, and I thank you for your work, because our local industry here has been really very largely decimated. You wouldn't know now in the Women's World Cup because there's so much to be said and spoken. But in recent years, so many of our football journalists have left the industry, in part because of the pressure that the game placed on them. And so accountability and independent public interest journalism in football in this country has been limited at best and lessened in recent years. But it is, in many of these respects, so very, very important. So I want to mention the other social causes and how football is going. We did have a very strong pushback with Visit Saudi recently, which you've heard about, which was excellent. Many former players, many journalists joined into that call, and ultimately Football Australia was able to join with Football New Zealand and call on FIFA to cease that sponsorship. And that was an important moment, because football very rarely will move unless the fans, the journalists, the former players, particularly the Players Association, who've been great leaders in this country, say that it has to happen. So the fans spoke, and football made a very strong response there. As it did, and I wanted to acknowledge the Socceroos with their video prior to Qatar. It's important. In fact, it was the strongest statement, of which we're very proud, and Francis as the chair, rightly so, strongest statement of any team in the world. In a country that is not known for making these statements either through sport or certainly not through football. And so the Socceroos being able to come together, commit to those basic rights for people, and use the appropriate language in an authentic, strong and real way was groundbreaking in a game where we saw the vast majority of federations around the world and later players step back from the advocacy that they had early been committed to. So well done to them. The voice to Parliament is an interesting one. I think all of professional sport in Australia has made a joint commitment to that. And once again, the question is, what are we doing underneath? Football has, I think, over 3,000 clubs around the country. And the opportunity is there for us to now take the next step, to have the conversations. There are a diverse range of views, of course, it's a referendum. But through football, our community could, and I think should, be utilising all of our club space to facilitate conversations so that all of our community is as well informed as we possibly can be. And I would love to see, and indeed have asked Football Australia to do so. Just recently, the PFA released some really disturbing research, which you might have seen, about the treatment of girls and women in football. Over 28%, over 1 in 4 of females who play the game in Australia have experienced some form of abuse, including the most heinous types, and harassment. Over 1 in 4. This World Cup is undoubtedly going to spur further interest in women's football in Australia, and rightly so. And there are some reports saying around 250,000 girls, new players, will come into the game in the next 12 months or 2 years. So the question that we should have is, what is the game doing about that? We need to ensure that with the uplift of the game, that every player has the right to safely participate and not to experience what so many of our female colleagues have done. You heard earlier the name of Lisa Devanna being mentioned. I wanted to mention her as well, just to acknowledge her courage, because the response of the game to one of our legendary players having to say publicly that she had been physically abused was horrendous. It was horrendous. The response was defensive. The response was limited. And in the end, Lisa has found no comfort, has found certainly no justice, and a range of other female players put forward a case for some form of abuse that they had also suffered, and they were told, you don't come within these terms of reference of the inquiry that was put together. That may or may not be the case, but what are we doing for them? How can we say to women and girls who've experienced some form of abuse, harassment in our game here, domestically, here's the terms of reference. We can't help you here, and we're not going to help you otherwise. So the game needs to look at these really fundamental questions. And my hope is that Lisa, through her extraordinary courage, does find justice. Because when she does, we will, and the game will be better. And as the research shows, it has to be. Wanted to mention the 1975 team. I saw that you've got, the book out there, The First Matildas. So I can't understand why they haven't been acknowledged. It seems totally crazy to me. As a former player, I support all other former players. And here we're in a World Cup at the moment where, we're not sure who was our first Indigenous player. We've got Auntie Tarita from 1975 who's being held up now, and rightly so. But, we've got a game going on last night with the first Indigenous Matilda there. I'd like to see that resolved, because pitting players against players is ridiculous. So this team went and represented Australia. It was an international competition. I remember the 1922 Australian team, male, wore maroon and blue shirts. Am I right, historians? Maroon and blue shirts. And they didn't wear green and gold, but it was international competition. And so for everything that's so beautiful about this World Cup, these are the elements that we as journalists, and we as football lovers and as former players, we need to make sure that these people have a voice and are protected. This is about culture, you've heard that. These organisations here are about building culture and understanding how we act, how we think, and how that might need to change. And I think these should be annual. I think all of the games should come together every year, and we should be able to have what you've heard here are courageous or uncomfortable conversations, because we need that. Just finally, I wanted to mention what is clearly still the great puzzle for the game. Last night, the Matildas had a wonderful win against France, and we're all very hopeful when they start next Thursday that they're going to do well. In fact, there's a good argument that in the next month, so powerful is a World Cup, and I might say we all, as football lovers, have a right to love the game, to enjoy the game, and to love the World Cup, but in order to do so, we have to hold it accountable. We can't do blindly. We can only love these days with our eyes open. And that's what the conversation here this morning was for. But for those of us who want to see, these conversations happen in football, sometimes it can be difficult because the game changes. And sitting on air and trying to commentate on the Qatar World Cup is very different today. But if we hold those two dualities together, we should be able to do so. That is, we deeply, deeply love and respect the game of football and what it gives this country and indeed what it offers the world. But we also know the dark side, and we are accountable and have to make sure that we do whatever is in our power to bring the game back into the light, if you like. The great puzzle here is finally to take what was extraordinary support for the Socceroos in Qatar. We had fan zones all around the country. In fact, the one in Federation Square was so full they had buses to bus other people to Amy Park, which itself was full. What a moment that was. But not just to see the fans, but to see who the fans were. To look at that group supporting the Socceroos and Matildas is to see the face of Australia. We don't always see that in other industries and other sectors and other forums, and not even in other sports. To see Australians shoulder to shoulder of every culture, of all heritage, of every faith, of every colour, is to see the beauty of Australia, the project of Australia. The puzzle for us now is to take that support and the love for the Matildas and finally transfer it to our domestic game. And is to somehow convince all of Australia that if you want to see more of that, come with us and watch this. Only some years ago we had Sydney derbies over 50,000. I think it was almost 60,000 out there. Incredible crowds, groundbreaking crowds for our domestic competition. We need to get there and exceed that again. That has to be the legacy of this World Cup. Not just interest, not just every 4 years for the Socceroos and Matildas, Australia being on board, but how do we make them on board 24 hours a day? If we can finally make that connection, which Les and Johnny were talking about for well in excess of 30 years, if we can finally build that connection, then Australia can become the place that we know it can be. One where the game is loved, and through the game we better understand inclusion, multiculturalism, anti-racism, and all the conversations that happen in a football room, but not everywhere. Thank you.